Hello and welcome to EDHREC's Upping the Average, where we take a commander's average decklist as compiled by the data on EDHREC and make some swaps to it to help take it from a good start to a great one. For this installment, I hope you've been practicing your cantrips. Talrand Sky Summoner is a 4-mana 2/2 merfolk wizard who used to reign supreme as the #1 mono blue commander. Whenever we cast an instant or sorcery spell, we create a 2/2 flying Drake token. Talrand's been along for a long time, so his page is really well established already. However, that also means that his page might not be as current as it could be. So let's see what's going on with Talrand's data by getting his average deck list from the average deck feature and importing it into the Architect deck building website. As always, any swaps we make must either keep the total price of the deck cost neutral or help lower the price of the overall list. Talrand is one of the top 3 commanders in the entire format who run the most instants in their deck. Famously, he runs a lot of counterspells, since every one of them he casts makes a Drake token, simultaneously pushing his strategy forward while limiting an enemy. That isn't the only thing happening in this deck though. If we assume Talrand is just a counterspell deck, we'd miss out on some of the really cool stuff that he can do. That's the type of underestimating mistake we can hope that our opponents fall into, but one that we should strive to stay one step ahead of. So let's take a closer look at this list in the following 3 ways: resources, selection, and, importantly, interaction. Let's start off with some resources. Talrand's deck currently has the benefit of being assisted by a bunch of support cards for instants and sorceries, but those support cards aren't instants and sorceries themselves. This is also a phenomenon that we notice a lot in artifact decks, for example, where there are a ton of cool enchantments that help support your artifacts and give you cool payoffs for playing artifacts. But for every one of those enchantments that you play, that reduces the number of cool artifacts that you can play and that those cards would then help support. So here for Talrand, when we're considering the support pieces for instants and sorceries too, we really do have to take that same lesson to heart and be very stringent with them. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to address is this here, Hull Breacher. This card is showing up in about half of the Talrand decks that have been built or updated since Commander Legends showed up. But that hasn't been like a ton of decks. This card is insane, but since it's new and expensive as heck, I'm going to operate on the assumption that not everyone actually owns this thing. Don't worry, if you're a Talrand player who wants to run a card like this because of how obnoxious it can be for the enemies, we'll have a section about some of those primo upgrades and cards you can cut for those a little bit later on in the video. With this out of the way, my attention now turns to cards like Jace's Sanctum and Naiad of Hidden Coves. These cards reduce the cost of our spells, and since Talrand has so many dang spells, it's pretty easy to see why they're here. However, I have some small but numerous issues with them. First, they don't assist other spell types. They only reduce our instant and sorceries. So there are 23 other cards in the deck that these don't affect at all. But even just looking at the instant and sorceries, there are actually about 13 spells that these cards still don't help reduce the cost of. It's even more when you factor in the fact that Naiad doesn't help our sorceries out because we're not really casting those on enemy turns. Second, these effects are supplanted already by no less than 3 other cards in the deck that have basically similar abilities, such as the card Baral. And finally, they're not spells themselves. I know that's a weird thing to say, like, of course the cards that reduce the cost of spells aren't also in themselves instants and sorceries. Doi, right? Well, yes, but let's see what we could be playing instead then. The first thing I want to do to help our mana out is get an Arcane Signet and Thought Vessel in here. 2 mana ramp is pretty big for Talrand to help get him out ASAP. It's a small thing, but I like that these tiny rocks have tempo and excellent utility. Next, it turns out we can find ramp in the form of spells. I'm adding in Mitotic Manipulation and Retraced Image. Both of these cards are super strange, but we can use them to put islands into play. I like these more than the cost reducers we saw earlier because these are themselves spells. The lands we accelerate with them are ramp for any spell type that we cast, but more importantly, these spells are not dead draws later in the game because our commander can still make drakes off of them. Alright, that was a quick and easy step 1, so now it's time for step 2. Let's talk about card selection. Here I want us to take a look at some card advantage effects and some cards that help us filter through the library, because as it turns out, I think that some of these are a little too strict to be as good as we deserve. As before, I am biasing away from non-instant and non-sorcery cards, and biasing towards instant and sorceries when possible. Precognition field catches my eye, and my own precognition is telling me that this could cause problems for us in the future. This is card advantage technically, but it comes in a needlessly limited form. Even if we have a lot of spells in the deck, a lot of them are restricted on their timing, especially counterspells. There are certain spells we could find on top of our library that make us stop because we don't want to cast them that way. My proposed swap here is a different and more efficient enchantment for this deck's evasive army, and that is Coastal Piracy. Not exactly a strictly budget card, but not the most tragically unbudget card either. We have other effects just like the piracy that are already in the deck too, and this is just one more that our flying drakes will love. We'll get a lot more card advantage from an enchantment like this rather than from the precog field. Next, I am just not liking the Wave Break Hippocamp. Once again, this is card advantage, but the timing is secretly dastardly. If we want to draw cards off this, it means we have to cast spells on enemy turns. But we might not want to. We might want to hold on to some of those instants for later, thanks very much. I'm saving my counterspells for the times when it really matters, not using them now just to draw a card off of the back of this horse-fish thing. After that, I want to discuss Archaeomancer. I love this card. Getting spells back is so cool. But in this specific deck, we have to ask, why are we using a creature to do that job? Talrand doesn't like creatures. Talrand likes instants and sorceries. I'm exchanging the Archaeomancer for a mission briefing. It surveils, it lets us reuse a spell, and best of all, it can make us an extra Drake token, unlike the Archaeomancer. It's getting to that point where I do want to critique the specific instant and sorceries we're using too, not just the non-instant and non-sorcery support cards. Specifically, I'm more suspicious of sorceries than I am of instants. Any instant will help keep mana up and will give us a lot more extra options for which spell we can cast as a result, because we do not like tapping out and therefore dropping our defenses. Thus, that scour of possibilities seems like a potential problem. It's not horrible on the first cast, but it's hardly grand either. The appeal really is that flashback cost so we can get 2 drakes from 1 card. But that's a lot of mana on that flashback cost, and lowering the shields like that is gonna invite some hate. I'm swapping this for a different spell that I like a lot better, and that's the card Dig Through Time. That is some excellent selection, and the instant speed is a huge factor here. Alright, things are looking good, but we're not done yet. It's time for part 3. Let's get interactive. This is the interactive part of the video. Click the screen here to unlock a new cutscene. No, I'm totally kidding. Very different type of interaction. Here, instead, what I want us to do is talk about cards that are going to help us keep up with our opponents. The first cut I have to make here is the Stormtide Leviathan. To be honest, my ideal Talrand deck probably wouldn't contain a single creature at all, but I'm sticking to the average and keeping some of those helpers around. This one, though, I struggled with a lot. 8 mana is just so much for a deck like this. Like, yes, this is the type of deck that can go into a longer game, but I had plenty of times where I literally couldn't even cast this thing at all. I'm also either going to break some hearts or potentially raise some spirits by cutting a couple of the counterspells. Lofty Denial, Mana Leak, and Dispel all dispellease me. There are occasions where the attacks from the leak or denial do indeed counter a spell successfully, but there are also times that they don't counter a dang thing. Some opponents and deck archetypes get around a mana tax like that very easily. Dispel, meanwhile, is a hard counterspell, but it's so limited in what it could do that I just never felt great about it. Maybe if you've got a lot of counterspell wars in your meta, this will be more necessary, but I'm not sure that's the typical experience for the average Talrand player. It certainly wasn't for me. If you dislike counterspells so you're happy I cut some of them, don't rejoice just yet. I'm cutting those, but I'm adding another, and that's the card Abjure. We have to sacrifice a Drake when we cast it, but it will immediately refund for us from Talrand's ability. It's a 1-mana counterspell that can be used to scupper an opponent or to save our board, and all it costs us is not really much of anything. Oh, heads up, by the way, if you're a Yuriko player, I'd like to retroactively add this card to my Yuriko video from a while back. Yuriko has no evasion of her own and often wants to leave the field to ninjutsu out again to get guaranteed combat triggers. And this is a great way to get Yuriko off of the battlefield and back into the command zone so she can be more easily cheated into play by one of those unblockable creatures. Where was I? Right, yes, back to the matter at hand, this card is also really good in Talrand. Sack a Drake, make a Drake, counter those spells. I've got 2 other trickier cards that I'd like to add in too, and they happen to make use of a mechanic that is not exactly very good in a lot of other places. I'm talking about the Cipher mechanic, specifically the cards Hands of Binding and Hidden Strings. These don't look like much, but Cipher works in a really interesting way. First, when we cast them, Talrand will, of course, make a Drake. Then, the Cipher card can be exiled onto any creature we have, including, if necessary, the Drake we just made if we want. But the real kicker is that when a creature with that Cipher spell on it hits hits an opponent, we cast a copy of that spell. This counts as a trigger for Talrand, so each of these Cypher spells can be another way to get free extra drakes while also fiddling a little bit with the board. It's a small, weird thing, but that extra free value is hard to pass up. Finally, I'm going to finish up this list with a favorite card of mine for creature-based blue decks, and that's the card Teferi's Veil. I've sung its praises before already. If we're afraid of losing our drakes, it turns out that one of the best ways to protect them is by hitting our opponents and letting them peace out. Alright, before we go, I want to give some honorable mentions for players who would like to stay a bit more budget-friendly with their Talrand lists, as well as for the established Talrand players who are looking to splurge or to upgrade. In terms of budget swaps, let's be real. Psych Rift, Sapphire Medallion, and even the next most expensive card, Primal Amulet, make up like over a third of the average deck's budget. For the Primal Amulet, don't even worry that hard about the back half of it, and just focus on the fact that the front half helps with mana. We'll be fine using a cheap rock like a Star Compass to help out there. Get your resources in good working order, and that will carry you so far in Commander. For the other two, I actually want to add in a pair of cards that I think amplify another card in the deck really, really nicely. There's a Behold the Multiverse in the deck already, but there are no other instant foretell cards here. If your opponents know your deck decently well, then that will affect whether they feel able to play around it. So to make that process much harder for them, and since we're not breaking the bank on cards like the Cyclonic Rift or the Sapphire Medallion anyway, might I recommend some mind games with cards like Saw It Coming and Spectral Deluge. These cards are way cheap, but way fun to turn your foretell potential into a nightmarish shell game. Now, much more difficult is what to cut if you're interested in upgrading the Talrand deck even further, including some of those pricier options. 3 cards I couldn't quite fit into the list were Veilstone Amulet, Gravitational Shift, and Overburden. Veilstone is a great method of protection for our Drake-making engine, helping turn any cantrip into reactive hexproof. I personally found that I liked the amulet in place of a card like Disdainful Stroke from the average list, which counters important stuff, but doesn't often help protect against any spells aimed at our commander. Then there's Gravitational Shift, a card that I like very much, but I can also see why Talrand players are potentially dubious about it when we're using cards like Rise from the Tides in the list. Still, the safety this enchantment provides against token decks is pretty huge, to say nothing of how important it can be to help our tiny flyers go from peck to punch and actually close out a game. So if you're interested in Grav Shift, it turns out that my recommendation is to swap it for Rise from the Tides. Oh, and remember how earlier I cut the Hull Breacher right away due to budget and accessibility reasons? Well, if you are interested in using a card like Hull Breacher here, I'd recommend using it in place of Murmuring Mystic. The Mystic can kinda help Talrand out, kinda, but the tokens are almost exclusively defensive and rarely help push out a victory or disrupt enemy activity in the way that a Hull Breacher will. Lastly, Overburden is exactly what its name entails. It is a nightmare, but if you're a Talrand aficionado, I suspect you might like a little grit in your games once in a while and won't mind losing a Chemister's Insight over it, since that spell's 4 mana anyway. Overburden has some very particular oracle texts that make it noteworthy for Talrand. It only counts creature cards entering the battlefield. It does not trigger on token creatures, so we can make creatures scot-free while our opponents are set back whenever they try to play out a single mana dork or utility creature. But most importantly, when upgrading Talrand, it must be said that the best cards to cut are the 3 mana counterspells. Toss them for cool 2 mana interaction like Muddle the Mixture or Narset's Reversal as soon as you can. And it also goes without saying that things like Fierce Guardianship are definitely the kind of thing this commander will be interested in too. Prioritize lowering the mana costs on the counterspells and removing the 2 specific counterspells as well. For now, though, let's look at that final list. This is a lot of spells, but I'm feeling good about so many of them, and the cards we've cut have helped make way for a more efficient and alert maker of drakes. You can find a link to this list in the description box below with the cuts in the maybe board. I hope you've enjoyed Summoning Skies with Talrand, and if you have any other recommendations for cards that you think your fellow Talrand players ought to be playing too, make sure you leave those suggestions in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching.